All right, so chapter 19, 10 tricks of neurons. You're saying this is how these tiny little cells basically run the show, our thoughts, feelings, memories, everything.
Exactly. It's like we're looking under the hood of the most complex machine we know, the human brain. It's amazing that evolution figured out how to build this incredible machine out of, well, living cells.
Okay, color me intrigued. So where do we even begin? What's the first trick these neurons use?
Well, right away we have a problem, size. Neurons are microscopic, but they need to make tons of connections to create complex networks.
So how do they do that? They can't just keep growing bigger, right?
You're right, and that's where dendrites come in. Think of them like branches on a tree, reaching out to catch raindrops. Except here, the raindrops are signals from other neurons.
Okay, more branches, more connections. But wouldn't that also mean signals from further out? Have to travel further to get back to the main part of the cell.
You got it. That's the trade-off. Signals from further out on a dendrite are weaker by the time they reach the cell body. Kind of like a game of telephone.
Makes sense. But wait, didn't the chapter mention dendritic spines? Are those just decorations?
Not at all. Dendritic spines are where the action is. They're these tiny mushroom-shaped structures, and they cover the dendrites. They act as the main connection points between neurons.
So it's not just about increasing surface area with the dendrites. It's also about concentrating connections with spines.
Precisely. And get this, those spines can actually change shape based on how active the neuron is, like a tree whose branches sprout new twigs, based on how much sunlight they get.
So every time we learn something new or have a new experience, our brains are rewiring themselves at a microscopic level.
Exactly. This constant reshaping of dendritic spines, it's thought to be a key mechanism behind learning and memory. The connections that are used more, they get stronger, and the ones that are neglected, they might weaken or even disappear.
Wow. Use it or lose it for our brains at a cellular level. Incredible. Okay, so we've talked about how neurons receive information, but how do they communicate with each other?
They use chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters are released from the sending neuron, and they bind to specific receptors on the receiving neuron, like a lock and key system.
So it's a coded message being sent from one neuron to another, but how does that actually translate into a signal that the other neuron understands?
Well, these receptors are called ligand-gated receptor. They're like gatekeepers. They control the flow of charged ions in and out of the neuron.
Okay.
Think of it like opening and closing a gate in a fence. And the flow of ions, that creates an electrical current, and that's how neurons transmit information.
So it's a chain reaction. The neurotransmitter binds the gate, opens ions flow, and boom, the signal's sent. But I thought there were different types of receptors. Do they all work the same?
You're right, not all receptors are the same. Some are fast-acting, like a direct phone line, while others are slower and more modulatory, like sending a letter. The fast ones, those are called ionotropic receptors, and the slower ones are metabotropic.
Interesting. So it's like different communication channels, depending on how urgent the message is.
Exactly, and this variety in receptor types, it allows for a lot of flexibility in how neurons communicate. But there's another layer of specialization. Different neurons have evolved to detect different types of information.
Okay, now this is where I really see the ingenuity. So you're saying not all neurons are created equal. Some are specialized for specific tasks.
Exactly. Some neurons have receptors that are specifically sensitive to light, allowing us to see. Others are sensitive to sound waves, so we can hear. And others are sensitive to pressure or chemicals, giving us our sense of touch and taste.
It's like dedicated antennas for different types of information, all feeding into this central processing unit, which is our brain.
That's a great analogy. And these specialized neurons, they form the basis of our sensory systems. They allow us to perceive and interact with the world.
All right, so we have these neurons detecting information, but how do they actually process it and make sense of it? That's where it gets really complicated, right?
It is complex, but fascinating. Neurons actually use the flow of charged ions to compute information. Remember those excitatory and inhibitory currents I talked about? Well, the neuron is always weighing the balance of these inputs. If enough excitatory signals come in, it triggers a special kind of electrical impulse, called an action potential.
Wait, action potentials. That's how neurons send signals over long distances, right? I've always wondered how they do that without the signal getting weaker. It's like sending a whisper across a room and having it heard loud and clear.
It's pretty amazing. Action potentials are like electrical pulses that travel down the neuron's axon, which acts like a cable, and they don't lose strength as they travel.
Okay, so what's the secret? How do they keep that signal strong over long distances?
That's where myelin comes in. Myelin is this fatty substance that wraps around the axon, and it acts like insulation on an electrical wire.
Ah, so it's like putting express lanes on a highway for faster travel. But wait, I thought there were gaps in the myelin. What are those for?
Those gaps, they're called nodes of Ranvier, and they actually speed up the transmission. The signal jumps from node to node instead of traveling continuously, like skipping a stone across a pond.
Okay, that makes sense. So myelin is like a speed booster for neuronal communication. But we've been talking about neurons like they're just passively receiving and sending signals. Is there any active control over this whole process?
There's definitely more to it. Neurons are actually incredibly dynamic. They adjust their sensitivity. To keep a balance of inputs, we call this neural homeostasis, like a volume control that's constantly adjusting the sound level.
So it's like a self-regulating system. Our brains need to be able to adapt because our environment is constantly changing. Speaking of adapting, we can't forget about learning. How do neurons actually change and form memories based on what we experience?
That's where synaptic plasticity comes in. It's the key to learning and memory, the strength of the connections between neurons. It can actually change over time. Based on our experiences, connections that are used more get stronger, and those that are neglected might weaken.
So the more we challenge ourselves and learn new things, the stronger those connections become. And the better we remember. It's like building mental muscle.
Exactly. And this ability of synapses to change over time, it's what allows us to learn new skills, form memories, and adapt to new environments.
All right, so we've covered a lot, how neurons receive and transmit information, how they specialize, and how they adapt and learn. But there's still so much more to explore.
Absolutely. And in part 2, we'll be diving into how these cells work together to form complex networks, process information, and create the phenomenon we call consciousness.
I can't wait. This is a journey I definitely want to be on.
It really is remarkable when you think about it.
It is. It really is.
It's a testament to evolution that such complex systems can come from the building blocks.
Yeah. To think our brains with billions of neurons and trillions of connections are essentially self-assembled from a set of genetic instructions. It's mind-blowing.
And those instructions can't spell out every detail of how the brain's wired. You'd need a huge genome if you tried to code every single synapse in our DNA.
So how does it work? We have like a rough blueprint, and the neurons just figure out the rest on their own.
That's a good way to think about it. The genes provide a roadmap, but a lot of the fan-tuning happens during development. It's a process of competition and refinement.
Competition, like neurons are fighting for survival.
Kind of. Neurons need activity to survive. If they don't get enough input, they die off. So during development, there are way too many connections. And the ones that are the most active and useful, they get strengthened and the others just fade away.
So like survival of the fittest, but for synapses. Only the strong connections survive.
Right. And this whole process is driven by a principle called homeostasis. You might recognize that from other biological systems.
Wait, homeostasis, isn't that about maintaining a stable environment? Like body temperature. What's that got to do with neurons?
It's the same idea, but it applies to neural activity. Neurons try to maintain a balance of excitatory and inhibitory inputs. Too much excitation makes the system unstable, but too much inhibition and everything shuts down. Homeostasis keeps things balanced.
A constant balancing act. Make sure the brain's active, but not too active.
Exactly. And this balancing act, it's not just during development, it goes on throughout our lives, making sure our brains run smoothly, even as we learn new things and encounter new environments.
Our brains are constantly adapting and recalibrating. Wow. But what about memories? Where do they fit in?
Memories are basically stored in the connections between neurons. When we learn something new, certain synapses get stronger. And those stronger connections, that's the memory.
So it's not like each neuron holds a memory. It's more about the connections between them.
That's it. The unique pattern of connections encodes the information. And when we recall a memory, those connections get even stronger. And that makes the memory easier to retrieve.
That makes sense. It's like a path in the woods. The more you walk it, the easier it is to follow. But are all memories created equal? Some stick with us forever while others just disappear.
You're right. Not all memories are stored with the same strength. Some memories, like those that are really emotional or have a big impact, they're more likely to be consolidated into long-term memory.
Like those flashbulb memories, where you were when you first heard about something big. Those are probably because of this stronger encoding, right?
Exactly. The emotional part of those events triggers a bunch of processes that enhance synaptic plasticity, and that makes those memories stronger and longer lasting.
That's so interesting. Like our brains know to prioritize the important memories.
And this leads us to another interesting thing about memory. Critical periods.
Critical periods. Didn't we talk about those? About brain development?
We did, but they're important for memory too. Critical periods are these windows of time during development when certain experiences are really important for shaping brain circuits, including the ones involved in memory.
So if you miss that window, is that it? Like if you don't learn a language early, are you going to have problems with it forever?
It's not that simple. While learning certain skills is easier during critical periods, it doesn't mean it's impossible later.
There's hope for us late bloomers then.
Of course, our brains are adaptable even in adulthood. It might just take more work to learn something new outside of its critical period.
Okay, that's good to know. How do these critical periods work, though? What's going on in the brain?
During critical periods, certain brain regions have a lot of plasticity. The synapses are really flexible, connections are formed and refined super fast, like the brain's in hyperlearning mode, meant to absorb everything.
So if a child is exposed to language at the right time, those circuits are going to be strong, making it easier for them to learn. But if they don't hear language, it might be harder for them later on.
That's the idea. And critical periods apply to other things too, like vision, hearing, and social skills. Early experiences really affect the wiring of these circuits, and that shapes how we interact with the world.
It really shows how important early childhood is. But wait, if these critical periods close, do our brains stop changing?
Not at all. The level of plasticity might go down, but our brains can still adapt and learn throughout our lives. This is what lets us keep learning new things, forming memories, and adapting to new environments.
So we might be able to learn things easier when we're young, but we're not stuck. Our brains can still change based on that experiences.
Exactly. Synaptic plasticity happens throughout life. It allows us to grow. As people, it might not be as fast as it is during those critical periods, but it's still happening, and when we challenge ourselves and learn new things, we're helping that process along.
Wow, this has been quite a journey into the world of neurons. It's amazing how much we've learned.
It has been fascinating, and we've only just scratched the surface.
But before we go on, as a question, we've talked about the electrical and chemical signaling in neurons. Can we unpack that a bit? It seems like a weird mix. You're right, it is a mix. It's what makes neurons so unique. They use electrical signals for fast communication within the neuron, and then they use chemical signals to talk to other neurons.
It's like having a high-speed train inside a city and a postal service to send messages between cities.
So the electrical signals are the bullet trains, zipping down the axon, carrying information, and then at the synapse, they hand off the message to the chemicals.
Exactly. The action potential travels down the axon to the synapse, and when it gets there, it triggers the release of neurotransmitters, those chemical messengers.
So the neurotransmitters are like mail carriers, picking up the message and taking it across the gap to the next neuron.
That's it. That gap is called the synaptic cleft, and the neurotransmitters, they just float across this gap and bind to receptors on the other side.
Okay, I'm with you so far. But how does the chemical signal become an electrical signal again in the next neuron? It seems like something's missing.
Remember those ligand-gated receptors? They're the key. When a neurotransmitter binds to a receptor, it makes the receptor change shape. And that change can open or close ion channels.
Ah, so those receptors are controlling the flow of ions. And that creates an electrical current.
Right. If there's enough excitation to hit a certain threshold, a new action potential is triggered in the receiving neuron, and the whole thing starts again.
Like dominoes. One neuron triggers the next, and the signal goes through the network.
Exactly. And this whole process is happening all the time. Throughout our brains, it's how we process information, make decisions, and experience the world.
It's crazy that it's all happening at such a small scale. Inside these tiny cells, we started by talking about how neurons deal with their size. And now we see how they use these signals to communicate and process all this complex information.
It really shows how evolution works, and the more we learn about neurons, the more we see how complex they are. They're not just switches, they're like tiny computers, integrating information, making decisions, and learning.
I see why the chapter called these tricks. It's like they have a secret language and tools we're just starting to understand.
And all of this complexity comes from simple biological building blocks. It makes you wonder what other secrets there are about the brain.
Well, this deep dive has definitely changed how I think about my brain.
Me too. It's a reminder that everything we do, think, and feel, it all comes down to these tiny cells working together.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up for today. This has been a fascinating journey.
It has. Until next time, keep those neurons firing. Who knows what you'll achieve?